ještě jednou dobrý den, dámy a pánové. Velmi rád vás vítám na psychiatrické klinice Všeobecné fakultní nemocnice a první lékařské fakulty v Praze. A myslím, že se scházíme u velmi význačné události, a sice přednášky pana profesora Davida Cromptona, který je profesorem psychiatrie, přiletěl z Austrálie. On se zabývá velmi po svých zkušenostech z privátní praktické medicíny, s psychiatrií, s komunitní péčí, s poruchami posttraumatickými, úzkostnými a tak dále. A já myslím, že hrozně se těšíme na jeho přednášku, kterou, když to téma vidíme zde, je to téma omezovacích prostředků, takže já nebudu dlouho mluvit a předám panu profesorovi slovo. So it's a great pleasure, Professor Crompton, to welcome you here at the Psychiatric Department, Charles University Prague, and we are very happy that you are here, and we are interested in your paper, which is already here. So, take the floor, please. Thank you.
First of all, good morning. As I said yesterday at a meeting, and I recognise some of the faces in the audience that I met yesterday, it is a great pleasure to be in Prague speaking to you. I see it as an honour to be invited to the city and the country. I am part of a group that is called Promise, and is promise.global. It combines services from Cambridge, Yale, Brisbane, Prague and Cape Town, and that will be expanding shortly, and it is also linked up to be linked up with the World Psychiatric Association, and its focus is going to be on how do we expand recovery-orientated care across the world and enhance the work that's being undertaken by quite a number of services. There is a good online program if you wish to have a look at what the group is doing. And prior to coming to Prague, I spent 5 days in Cambridge with the team over there, and we are already starting to work on some joint projects to allow us to evaluate the efficacy of some of our programs. The title today is Can We Escape Bedlam? Is it possible to seek seclusion and restraint? I don't know whether any of you have visited what is the Bethlehem Hospital in London, which ultimately became Bedlam, known as Bedlam. I think one of the things about mental health care, and you see this around the world over the centuries, there is a lot of good intent that starts. So Bethlehem Hospital was started as a social environment to help people when there were really no other treatments for mental illness. But gradually what occurred is people began to be placed in the mental health facilities to get people off the streets, and gradually it reached a point where in the 19th century, this is a very famous story of an United States merchant seaman who was put in seclusion, or restraint and seclusion, and was ultimately found dead there, which created a degree of furor in the United Kingdom or in England. And it's one of, I think, sadly, the history that often gets repeated. We have a lot of good intentions, but we begin to get overwhelmed by the pressure of patients, the cost of providing services, and we forget what our whole purpose is about, is being patient-centred in the care that we deliver. These are the changes that have occurred in our services. I've just tried to put up some pictures of what our hospitals are now beginning to look like. So it's changing from very old services, but even some of our services, this one here is, for us, it's quite old. It dates back to the 1980s. Nowhere near as old as the services in Europe. But what we've been trying to do is modernise that building within our resources. And one of the things, it's a bit hard to see on this photograph, but one of the things is we've painted murals that have been decided by patients what the murals should look like. This mural here is actually a seaside scene. The reason being is it sits beside some of what are called the Bay Islands in Brisbane. And so it's a very much a coastal city or coastal area. It's surfing beaches and other things that people access. And then these are our new wards or rooms. This is a vision that is taken from the virtual tours that you can see online, but it expands it out. And this is one of our new community care units that we have in one of our suburbs. I think the statement I've got there is healthier and more positive uses of music. Give young people with mental difficulties a glimpse of well-being, having fun, being happy, and doing the things they love doing. And that is part of the motto in one of our adolescent units, where we have a very intensive music program. And I was at a service yesterday where they have music, but it's a therapy program that we operate and is run by a person who's a specialist in music therapy from one of the universities. Just to give you an idea of what our service looks like, to travel from here to here takes you roughly around 3.5 hours. And we have a population of about 1.2 million people. And if you want to go across to these islands, it takes you about 40 minutes by boat to get across to the clinics. So one of the things that's led to us to start to do is utilise things like telehealth, which is in the clinics. And very shortly we're going to be putting iPads in the patients' homes so that we can talk to them instead of spending a lot of time travelling out on boats. We'll be able to talk to them every day if we wish using an iPad. Today I've been asked to talk particularly around the issues of seclusion and restraint. The title I've given this is Zero Rates of Seclusion and Restraint. Is it a dream too far? And the other aspect of this talk is about making sure we keep our eye on the goal of what we're seeking to achieve. Just to remind people that patients admitted to our hospitals often come from the streets. They're disorganised, they're dishevelled, they're at times not having food, they're quite distressed, and then they come into hospital and they're agitated. The painting at the picture at the top is undertaken by a patient, and it's her perception of what being put in seclusion was like. It is being stripped of your dignity, it is being exposed to everyone, and that was her perception of what seclusion was like. The other picture is, which is a padded cell. Again, this was actually taken from a picture by a man who wanted to set up what his perception of it was rather than the reality. And I think that's one of the struggles we have to deal with, is our perception as clinicians, and there's the perception of our patients. One of the things we've been doing in our service as we make change is that we see it as part of a journey. And to take that journey, you have to understand the problems that confront you within your service. So one of the things we became aware of was that seclusion and restraint when I arrived back in Queensland from another place I'd been working at. To my mind, there seemed to be some problems in that we seem to be having a number of people going into seclusion more than what I was used to. So the first part that we did was to actually try and get some baseline data. The data included, we did chart reviews to look at the medication that was being used by people. We interviewed qualitative surveys with staff, some patients. It's a small number of patients, because as you can imagine, it's actually difficult to get patients who have been in seclusion to agree to a talk. But one of the things we did is we did focus groups with patients and staff around their perception of what we're doing, and we also did some qualitative assessments. To remind you, this is what our seclusion area looks like. You'll notice we actually don't put beds in there. Part of the reason for that is for a safety purpose, that people have been injured patients injured because they're thrown back onto beds, staff get pushed and get injured, and so we have these areas. And of course, people aren't in there generally very long these days. And of course, these are some of the visions of the older places that existed for us. So the first thing we did was we had a look at some of the facts. The first part of this service was correct. When I looked at it, the seclusion rate was 12% compared with the average nationally, which was 10%. The re-seclusion rate was probably even more significant because that 76% of people who were secluded were more likely to be re-secluded, which is much higher than the national average. 87% of seclusion for longer than 4 hours, compared with the national average, and approximately 1/3 of cases the documentation was incomplete in the service where I returned to. The other important part that we found when we began to talk to patients was that for consumers, in Australia there's been this debate over whether people are patients or consumers or clients. The Minister of our government in our state resolved that problem by getting up and saying, in Queensland, everybody is a patient. So I have to follow the dictates of what government says. So sometimes I'm a bit interchangeable in the way I speak. But when we wrote this paper, it was about consumers. They certainly saw this as non-therapeutic. They saw it as punishing. In contrast, staff generally view it as appropriate and potentially therapeutic. So there are different sets of views. A little bit hard to see on this slide. What we did was we took at the hospital where I was at, which was Princess Alexandra, and this is the seclusion rate for our hospital. This is, interestingly, this is the Queensland rate, and this is the national rate. Interestingly, even despite my perception that we were doing badly, we were doing better than the rest of the state. The next part was set 2 or more seclusions. There's the data there. We were worse than the rest of the state, but certainly much worse than the rest of the country. And these are our durations. Our service that I had then was this figure here, and the other part was the number of hours. Interestingly, if you were secluded at night, you tended to remain in the seclusion area much longer. And there are a number of reasons for that, but we'll come to that later. So we undertook a lot of work, and I'm just going to show you some of the impact of that work now. I made the comment that we had to keep our eye on what we're doing. Part of the reason for that is very shortly after we did this study, our services in our area were amalgamated. So we went from 3 services into 1. So my life got taken up by looking at standards of care across 3 services. It was taken up with looking at fixing up budgets that had been problematic, looking at staffing levels which were variable. So some hospitals had more staff than the others, some community sites had more staff than the others. So it was unequal in terms of distribution of services. And so I had to spend a lot of time doing that. And as a consequence of that, what began to occur is there was a change. The seclusion rates started to go up again. So there was one of the lessons we had. It's about making sure you keep your eye on what's occurring. This is some data from this hospital that we first did the study on. And you'll see in November 2014, these are the seclusion rates. So these are the number of seclusions per 1,000 occupied bed days. And then, as we got up to here, then by this stage, I was able to swing my attention to what was going on. And you can see very quickly, it came back down once we moved our attention to it. So one of the lessons we've learned is how do we make sure that we keep our eye on the ball and focus on the critical issue of care for people and not let things slip. Now, what I'm going to do now is show you, this is the data for the rest of our hospitals. And what you'll see is that overall, the figures are coming down, except you'll notice this here. And this is for a hospital called Logan Hospital. You'll see a marked spike. The thing now is, because we're keeping our eye on what's going on, I actually know which patients are causing those spikes and what the issue is. And so that's the focus we can drill down to at a patient level, and getting staff to go away and better manage these problems. The other aspect is understanding, so this is the actual data, and these figures are for 6 months. You'll notice that one of our services here had no seclusion at all for a number of months. And some of our wards now, our larger parts of our hospitals where they have separate wards, will go for several weeks without anybody being secluded. And that's been part of that process of putting things together. And this is for children and adolescents. This is some data again that goes for a 12-month period. Again, these extra high rates here relate to individual patients. And we know who they are, and we know, and the planning is the next time they come into hospital, we work out how we can manage that and try and prevent that occurring. Again, to just remind you what it's like being in seclusion, this is a lady who's looking up at the camera. And I think that's one of the things that you need to put yourself in the position what it's like for patients being in those situations. You'll notice one of the things I haven't talked about yet is restraint. One of the reasons I haven't talked about it so far is because restraint is so infrequently used. It's only allowed for certain purposes. So we will go for, we can go for several months without having to use restraint. And part of that is that there was a law brought in that the only way you could use restraint is if you've got permission of the chief psychiatrist for the state, and you had to justify why you were doing it. So again, there are very specific reasons, and I've used the example of a gentleman who had a very severe physical illness, was very unwell. If we'd given him medications, we probably would have, he would have likely, in all likelihood, have died. So we were required to restrain him and give it a low dose of medication to contain what was occurring. But to undertake that, we had to get permission of the chief psychiatrist, but we also engaged his parents so that they were aware of what was going, because it was a very unusual situation for us. I'll just take you back now to what we did with this study. The first part we looked at was, there was an instrument by Heyman called the Attitudes to Seclusion, and then we used that in facilitated focus groups. The first thing that we noticed was that there are a number of themes that came out. The first theme was about, well, what were the reasons for seclusion that people gave, the effect of seclusion both on consumers, patients, and the staff, and then as I've said, the staff and consumer feelings, and then the other aspect were their suggested changes. And I think that's the other aspect of this. If you're going to make change, while there can be some top-down direction given, it is important that staff as a whole begin to accept responsibility for change and begin to own that and institute the changes in conjunction with consumers and carers. In our service, we've introduced peer support workers. And peer support workers are seen as equals in terms of their expertise, in terms of the cycle of care of individuals. And we also have consumer and carer consultants. So what we found was a bit over half the staff gave strong support for seclusion. Many of them saw it as an appropriate therapeutic measure. The majority of the staff believed that seclusion created a low stimulus environment. However, if you happen to watch people in seclusion, if they're awake, it's certainly far from low stimulus for them, because they're trying to engage with the walls and the beds, or the bed on the mattress on the floor. They believed it was necessary to successfully de-escalate aggressive or inappropriate behaviour. And indeed, for many, they saw that was the only way that you manage it. Interestingly, only one patient actually knew why they'd been secluded. The focus group also clarified that there was a lack of awareness why seclusion was used by patients. And what it engendered in patients was a feeling of bewilderment and mistrust. When we worked more with the staff, they largely rejected the notion of seclusion as being a punitive measure. However, patients actually had a different view. They saw it as a punitive process being acted out towards them by staff. And I'm sure some of you have read the papers around the development of PTS, post-traumatic stress disorder, in patients who have been admitted to mental health hospitals, and from the treatment they're given, and this is certainly probably part of the genesis of that traumatic experience. As I said, patients, consumers saw it as punitive. They saw it as retribution for non-adherence to what staff wanted them to do. And whether that was about not taking medication, or it was being told to come to the meal table, or being told to go to their room, or to sit down somewhere. They saw this as, because they didn't do that, they saw it as retribution. Now remember, this is the patient's perception. It may not necessarily be the reality, but it's how they perceive it. The staff gave us fairly complex responses. Many staff expressed a sense of regret. They saw it as an inadequacy on their part in terms of treatment. It caused stress within them, and they began to question what else they could have done. A number of staff expressed the view that they had felt that they were abandoning patients when they were putting people in seclusion, and they felt this responsibility. There is, however, the other group that were rather indifferent to it. They felt no emotional attachment to the decision. They simply saw it as therapeutic, and it was based on a clinical decision and a professional judgment. The factors identified by our staff that influenced the likelihood of people being secluded was in fact the facility itself. What did it look like? What was its design? They commented about the absence of what we call a withdrawal room. Its other name is a quiet room. And also the other term that is used now in various places is called a snoozling room. We didn't have any of that there at the site. They described that there was a lack of a green and smoke-free space within the unit. Now, since this work has been done, our whole hospital is smoke-free. You are not allowed to smoke by law within 5 minutes of the hospital ground, and that includes all mental health patients. So we manage that. Again, there's often a fear by staff is that if you stop people smoking, that you increase the level of aggression. But in fact, that is not what the evidence shows. The other thing they identified our staff was a lack of a dedicated vulnerable ward for particularly fragile patients. And there were little alternatives to providing de-escalation. The other comments by our staff, and also by patients, was the acuity and level of need within the patient population. And then I paraphrase the patient's words, but they saw people very distressed, they saw them very unwell, and they identified that that was a problem. In our services, people from, if you go into prison and you're identified as having a mental illness, you are not allowed to be treated in Queensland in a prison for a mental illness against your will, so that if you need treatment under the Mental Health Act, you have to be transferred to a psychiatric hospital. And that sometimes means that we have 2 or 3 patients in a high dependency unit who have come from prison. What we've found is the other patients know that even though we don't say anything, they begin to learn these are prisoners, they become fearful, and they begin to react to that, and that creates anxiety, and it acts out in The other factors that were identified was the skill mix of staff, their expertise, and also the collective experience of staff in using seclusion or not using seclusion. So those who were experienced in not using seclusion had lower rates of seclusion occurring on their wards, whereas others who had not really been trained in the area tended to seclude people more readily. So what this is pointing to, that the notion of being placed in seclusion is not necessarily a factor of the individual's illness. It's a number of factors, but it's also about the training of our staff. So these choices came from our patients and our staff. They recommended a range of changes. They wanted educational workshops to support staff in how to identify risks that lead to the use of seclusion. One of our areas now is using an instrument that, which I can't remember the name of, but comes from, I think, Holland, where what they're doing is measuring people's behaviour and risks and determining about interventions that could be utilised prior to the person being placed in seclusion. So we're aiming to prevent seclusion. And what we're seeing so far, in its early days, is that's beginning to work. The next step was about making sure our structure had in place every time somebody was secluded, there was a requirement that there be a meeting afterwards to discuss what happened, an evaluation of the event, and to look at what other plans might be able to be put in place to prevent re-seclusion on this episode of admission or in future episodes. It was about using proactive information from patients proactively, and it was also about planning for patients when they arrived on the ward. The other part was then inviting more active consumer participation in their care planning. And then they wanted us to redesign the wards. Now, as you can imagine, redesigning hospitals is not necessarily always that easy. When I left Australia, we were in the process of redesigning this unit to divide up what was previously 3 wards into, it was going to be 4. There's going to be made a female ward, a male ward, a mixed ward, and then there'll be a high dependency unit. So the number of staff per ward will give a better staff-patient ratio, and also give us a greater sense of security for people who are vulnerable. So they're the things that are beginning to happen. And these all came from staff and patient suggestions. So the key issues from this study, and I've gone through that, is about the facility. The reasons for seclusion are not always clear, that they're a mixture of reasons. A lot of staff feel that's what you have to do, but what we were able to, ultimately we've demonstrated, is that we don't have to do that. In the recent weeks where we've had no patients placed in seclusion, one of the things I do when our staff have done very good jobs on something, I write them a letter congratulating them on their performance. I wrote a letter to the team, the unit that had had no seclusions. Unfortunately, what hadn't been told is that one of the other units hadn't had seclusions either, so there's a degree of distress that they'd been forgotten. So now, and so I had to write a letter to them also. Now I understand there is great competition to get a letter from me. I'm not sure that my signature is that important, but it's an incentive. People feel valued. And it's not just a letter, it's what I write in the letter. It's about recognising the care they're giving, the support that they're giving to patients and families, and it's praising them for the good work they're doing. I think that's an important step. The article provided a number of strategies. Now, the question goes, it's a very small study. How does this reflect the broader literature around what we're doing in the world? In Australia, these seclusion bans are these time. You're not allowed to tie someone to a bed unless there's given specific permission and for specific reasons. And as I said before, I've only done that once in probably about 8 years, because we just find it's not necessary. And the other part is about making sure we create hope in people. So what does the literature tell us? First part is that there are countries where it's forbidden. Seclusion is restraint. So they learn to manage somehow or other. There are certainly variations across states and countries and towns at ways of seclusion. And if you think about that, it really doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense because patients, yes, there is some variability where it cover a large catchment. Our hospitals range from inner city hospital where there's a lot of drugs and alcohol problems down to smaller places where the problems are more social stress, still a lot of drug and alcohol problems, but not as much in the way of severe mental illness in terms of the admissions because they're different populations, different ages. However, the seclusion rate shouldn't vary that much because you still get people with schizophrenia. So that's one part. So it raises those questions of why we need to have this coercive behaviour. The other part is trying to look at study designs. And when I was looking at this morning, it still puzzles me, is that what you'll see is that this group, they looked at changing the structure of the unit. And what they did was they restricted patient access to a waiting room area. The consequence of that is that there was a reduction in the rate of seclusion and restraint in that unit. I still don't understand why if you reduce space, it does that. So it must have been something about the design of the area. And they went back and they replicated it, and the same thing happened. So it is about that they reduced openness of the unit, resulting in a reduction of seclusion and restraint. But the aspect is, why did it do that? So it is something to be mindful of. If we change the design of something, we can actually begin to make a difference in the use of restraint and seclusion. Again, just to remind you of the practices, as I say, these are the ones we tend to use in Queensland. They're attached to your belt. So the person's still able to walk around, they've still got some freedom to get around. But as I point out, we rarely have used them. These are from a picture of one of our very old hospitals, and this is the way they restrain people. You could imagine lying like that to, one, the outcome for physical health, but also what that would mean to patients. Okay. So some further comments about making the right decision. This is from a study that looked at seclusion and restraint in the UK. And certainly there is this perception in places that I've been to around the UK, it's either right or wrong. You either do it or you don't do it. And it's really a debate that exists. I've noticed when I've been in the Czech Republic, I've been to a number of hospitals now, there are areas where there is no evidence of restraint being used, there's no seclusion rooms being used, and yet there are other places where these are regularly used. And so there's something different that goes on, and it's something that we need to think, why are we doing it this way? There is this argument, there will always be service users who cannot control their violence, and for that small percentage services will have to intervene to maintain a safe environment for them and for staff. And I do think we need to remember in this safety of staff, because staff do get injured when people become violent. We need to think about how we're going to manage that. And part of that, again, there is some evidence, it's about the environment that you create. Certainly legislation plays a part, and we need to think about what legislation looks like. An example of that in our state is seclusion. It used to be that you could seclude somebody for up to 8 hours. There was an argument that was put out that, you can't reduce that. The chief psychiatrist at the time put out a mandate that you could no longer seclude anybody more than 3 hours. And virtually everybody complies with that now. People have worked their way around the problem. So it's when you challenge clinicians, they work their way around it. So some of the papers have come through and they talk about seclusion and restraint. Why do we reduce it? thing to do. That's one set of views. That's based around clinical reasoning. It's less traumatic for patients. It's more manageable for people in what we're doing. A number of years ago, I participated in a study, and one of the things we used was the excitement phase of the PANS to evaluate people in the high dependency area. And we made judgments around medication based on their excitement phase scores. And we had a set of formulas of how to use the medication. What we found was that, first of all, the overall use of medication declined. The next thing we found is the rate of seclusion declined. And finally, the length of stay in the high dependency unit declined, and it declined to the point where, in fact, most people who were in the high dependency area were discharged from hospital faster than the people who'd been in the general hospital area. Because we developed a strategy for managing that it was not just about medication, it was about support and other therapies that we gave people. It is about actually, the other part is emphasising the giving clinical reasoning skills to clinicians and training people for critical analysis of what's occurring. Part of my job at times, I go and sit in wards and just watch what's occurring around me. And you watch staff who are trying to be kind at getting people's space. And so the person begins to react. And part of that is a cultural set. I've said at other meetings, in our area of our mental health services, we have roughly 189 languages spoken. So you have an enormous array of different cultures. And so you have to learn what is the cultural values and norms and how you deal with that. And that can influence your response. So one of the things we have cultural experts that come and teach people around those areas. And the other aspect is about having active reflection. Because quite often what you see is staff, they seclude somebody and they get on with the next job instead of sitting back and saying, well, what happened there? So one of the things we've mandated is there needs to be reflection time. Now that, sometimes you can't do that immediately after the meeting, but at some stage within the next 24 hours, there's got to be an active reflection by senior staff around what occurred. And that involves nurses and doctors and allied health. Now this is a study from Pennsylvania. And they looked at their security strength over a period between 1990 and the year 2000. And they looked at the rate of staff injuries from 1998 to 2000 in their system. Now, what you notice, and I'll show a slide of that, is this decline in the use of seclusion and restraint. And there are the figures there. They go from 3.5 to 1.2 for restraint, and the duration of restraint went from 11.9 hours to 1.9 hours. So it is possible. What they did notice again is this problem which we need to keep going back to, is that there are different groups secluded at different rates. And that is not necessarily about what's wrong with the patient. It seems to be something about racial issues, and it is also about ethnic minorities treated differently. It is also interesting that at night time there are changes. Seclusion occurred less, but it lasted longer. You remember back in my early slide, it showed that our seclusion at night lasted longer. Now, again, intuitively you go, well, what is that about? Is it the staff have gone to sleep, and so people stay in there longer, or is the patient's gone to sleep, and so therefore you think it's reasonable to keep people locked in a room because they've gone to sleep, or is it something else? And so it requires a degree of reflection and going back around that, rather than giving people access to the space and improving their level of dignity. The other aspect is that restraint was more often likely to occur during the week than during weekends and holidays. So again, this is not about the patient. It's about what we as clinicians are doing, because patients don't necessarily change their behaviour because it happens to be a weekend. Sunday is not necessarily a day of rest for patients, nor is it when you have a public holiday that they decide to be quiet. The other aspect is younger patients were more likely to be secluded and restrained, but if you're an older person, you spend longer in seclusion or being restrained. So this is the data that comes out of this. As you can see, this is seclusion, 1990, 4.23 per 1,000 patient days. By 10 years later, 0.28. You look at the rate of mechanical restraint, 3.51 per 1,000 days, down to 1.2 within 10 years. So there's a lot of things that people can do, and I'll talk about some of those in a few moments. So what are the factors that influence this? One of the issues is advocacy. So advocacy in Australia is undertaken by consumer and carer groups. It is undertaken by the mental health commissions. So in Australia, one of the things that we have, every state and the Commonwealth of Australia has what's called the Mental Health Commission. And their development is to about setting standards for mental health care delivery. So they don't deliver any care. In some states they do fund care. In our state they don't. What they do is they put up a set of expectations. And one of those expectations is no persons shall be secluded. And if the figures that the state produces doesn't show a decline in seclusion, reaching the goal, they then go and begin to ask the health services why you're not achieving that goal. And you have to then demonstrate why you're not doing it. So it puts the onus back on us to think about our processes. The next aspect is about state policy change, and I mentioned one of those. There's going to be a change to the Mental Health Act in Queensland soon that will put forward further constrictions around what we do. The next part is about improved patient-staff ratios. We have a staff ratio of 1 nurse to 4 patients in open wards. In high dependency units, it's 1 to 2. And if necessary, it goes 1 to 1 to support patients, particularly vulnerable patients. At night time, the ratio goes down to about 1 to 7 because people are asleep. There's going to be some legislation shortly that will add a requirement that we have more nurses on night duty. The next part is about having teams that respond to people who are in distress or being aggressive. So instead of it being individual nurses or doctors, we have a group of people who are more specialised in responding to that level of distress in individuals, so that they try and work with them not to react in certain ways. An example of that is not long after I came to the hospital, there was a gentleman that people wanted to put in seclusion because he was being aggressive. I happened to be walking through the ward. I went up to him with one of the people who respond, who are the responders to these processes, and I stood at a distance from him and we talked about the problem he was experiencing. And I said to him, I went through what was going on, and I said, well, has anybody offered you anything that might help you feel a little more relaxed at the moment and giving you some space? And of course the answer was, in very good Australian swearing words, what I could do with myself. But he began to listen. I got a staff member to go and get me some medication because people had been threatening him with an injection. I gave him a tablet, and he took the tablet, and he never ever did go into seclusion. It was about the way you approached it. It's about having people with expertise there. The other changes we've seen were made, is that second generation antipsychotics have had some influence. Now, I'm sorry this graph doesn't come out very well, but it's a child and adolescent unit. It's ours, and it follows the introduction of what we call call as a snoozling room, which is a quiet space where people can use safety blankets, and they have, for young people, they have large teddy bears, and they have chairs, and they can go and sit and listen to whatever music they want to, and they remain in that space. Now, this is they've used the word restraint there, but it's really seclusion. They had a definition of anybody who was placed in an area where they couldn't freely move around. They were defining at the time as that as being restrained, as opposed to being secluded. So these are the snoozling sessions where they were introduced, and then restraint episodes. As you can see, what happened as the number of hours or number of people going into snoozling rooms increased, and the use of that process increased, there was a gradual decline in the number of restraints, until we reached a point where in 12 months, a bit over 12 months, it had got down to zero use of seclusion or restraint. And what pleases me is that by and large that figure remains like that for our young people. They very seldom go into seclusion and restraint. A couple that do are very specific patients that have come from prison, who are young adolescent males, who are a very large Pacific Islanders, so it reflects this minority issue, but they're also very strong and very violent. I gather, talking to Pavel, who's down the front yesterday, some of you may have watched the Rugby Union World Cup on television, and there's a group called the All Blacks, who always seem to win most games. They're very, very big men, and they're adolescents at the age of 16, roughly the size of their front row forwards, so they're about 16 stone. They'd be about 120 kilograms. They're usually about 6'3" to 6 foot, about 188 centimetres tall, and they're very big men, even at 16, and they can be very aggressive. And so there's some of the groups, but we've begun to look at, well, what can we do about this to prevent it occurring? And that's a challenge for us. So you can see the impact of using safety snoozling rooms, and also safety blankets and other strategies. So this is from the Pennsylvania studies. The issue that was identified in this work is that the more coercive you become if you're a nurse, there seems to be problems that arise. And they lose the ability to be able to contain what's going on. And so, therefore, ultimately what they began to see was that in those nurses with less skills about managing or who tended to act in a coercive manner, they found that what they were doing was being injured more frequently. And certainly that's my experience. While it's not always true, it is an experience that we see. What it required was teaching people new ways to do things. I don't need to remind you that occupational, I don't know what it's like in the Czech Republic, but certainly occupational violence is a thing for mental health services, particularly in Australia where we have quite a bit of problem with methamphetamines and alcohol, and it becomes an issue. And as I've said there, it's often seen the only way you manage this is by secluding people. However, I think what's important is there's really been no good studies that have been, or seem to be no good studies I'm aware of, that show what is the impact on occupational safety if you reduce the level of violence and if you reduce the rate of seclusion. And I think that's something that we need to go and look at carefully, certainly in the Australian environment. The next part is, I keep going back to this thing, it's about particular patients. Certain patients end up in seclusion more frequently than others, and they spend longer in there. A study that was undertaken in South Australia looked at this problem, and they also looked retrospectively at an audit of seclusion over close to at almost a 2-year period, and they looked at 18 mental health units in the state of South Australia. Now, South Australia is in basically central Australia. It's a relatively small area. The total population of South Australia is not much more than the population of the area that I'm responsible for. It's a large capital city. A lot of people who come to hospital come from large distances, and they're brought into hospital. What they found again is this issue that seclusion events were a relatively small proportion of patients, accounted for nearly 40% of the events. 10% of patients accounted for over 50% of the hours. And yet people didn't seem to be looking at what the problem was. There was wide variation across units, and males experienced more containment than females, and they also had longer hours. What were the reasons people were secluded? Prevention of harm to others, prevention of destruction of property, and then there was a small group of people who requested seclusion. Now, some of this sort of work has started to lead us to develop what are called advanced care plans for people hospitalised. And one of those options in an advanced care plan is because some patients actually describe feeling safer in the enclosed environment, is that we're including that in that process for them. But instead of using a seclusion room, we'll use a snooze room type room or a quiet room. So, but often it seems to be about prevention of harm to others. So does this stuff work if we make changes? This is from Delaware. The purple line is seclusion, the yellow line is restraint. Again, what you see is something about cultural values here. In Australia, we don't have much in the way of restraint. In the United States, in this area, they have a lot of restraint versus lesser amounts of seclusion. As you can see that over a period from 2005 through 2012, restraint and seclusion virtually disappeared. So it is possible to make a difference. Now, how can we do this? Importantly, it's about understanding that it's a complex process. First of all, you've got your clients or patients. It's about their age, it's about their sex, it's about their nationality, it's about their diagnosis. It's about understanding what are the factors within that individual, and that it's not a one-size-fits-all. The other side across that equation, which is going across to here, it's about the care providers. So it's about our nurses, it's our doctors, our allied health, it's about our peer support workers. It's about their educational level, their training. I mentioned at the other talks is that a number of years ago, Australia changed their registration requirements for nurses, and that previously there was a category for mental health nurses, and they abolished that and made it you're either a general nurse or you're a midwifery nurse. What that then did is the amount of time people spent in training for mental health care in the nursing degree was down to about 6 weeks. So what you had is a group of people arrive on wards that were quite often very inexperienced in their first years, who were anxious about what they were being confronted with, and they would respond with aggression, to aggression with aggression. And the aggression meant that they were trying to put people in seclusion. And so one of the things we've done is started to have our nurses go join a college of mental health nursing, which is 2 years of training. And then many of our nurses have now achieved master's degrees in mental health nursing. And we've got at least one who's got a PhD in nursing, and there are others who are starting to move towards that. The other thing that happened in our area is we had a change in the level of experience of nurses. We had the hospital, because it was being ran for a number of years, there'd been a lot of nurses who had joined it when it first opened, and they were now retiring, as young nurses coming in. So a lot of that experience had disappeared. The other part was the level of stress that we need to think of, and it is about our training, but it's also about attitudes. We then come down to the environmental factors. We talked about that. The level of support, the level of personal freedom, the level of intimacy people can have with relatives, the existence of activities, and physical space. I once visited a hospital in the United States, and the head of the service said, I want you to come with me and I want you to go into a ward that is guaranteed to produce violence. Which sort of astounded me. And what we ended up was in a space that was as big as this table here, where 2 men would be put, and that was their outdoor recreational area. And this was for a forensic ward, where every person, I think, in there had either killed somebody or raped somebody. And so you can imagine what would happen when they would start to attack each other. And that was, and he tried for years to get it changed. And he kept running up against a brick wall. So one of the things that the health service began to do there, separately, because it's a different funding model, they developed houses that became hospitals. So that patients could present early, be admitted to this house, which was like anybody's house. But people would stay there, and I met some of those patients. I always remember talking to one of the ladies, and I talked to her about coming here, and she said, yes, I had been in the state hospital once. And she said, I learned my lesson. If I present early, seek treatment early, then I never need to be in a place like that ever again. So it is about the physical environment. The next part is about organisational factors. It's about documentation, it's about reduction plans, it's about the formation of the way the service looks. And you remember at the beginning I said you need to keep your eye on the ball, or keep your eye on the processes. This is the significant part of this. And that was one of the things we did not do when we amalgamated our services. It came at a cost. Our seclusion rates went up. Then it needs to be about partnerships and freedom of expression of care providers. So people need to be in an environment as a carer, but also as a carer of patients. So the staff need to be able to express their own view, and that guides nurses' decision on seclusion. So it's a very complex process, but it takes a lot of work to actually get there, and it takes time. And it will not happen overnight for you. I'm sorry this hasn't come up very well. It's one of, I do most of my slides on Apple, and when you convert them across to Microsoft, it creates some problems. Again, this is a drawing of a patient who went into seclusion. It was seen by this patient as being solitary confinement. That was his perception. I assume it's a he because there's a balding attached to it. But what this was looking at is from some work done in Virginia, looking at systems theory and using seclusion. So the first part about it is, what is the leadership of the organisation? The organisation needs to have a will to want to change. But if the will is only from the people at the top, then you're going to be defeated. You have to work with everybody. The next part was about communication. So it's about working with staff, it's about talking to them about the benefits, because staff often are very concerned if you remove seclusion and restraint from their ability to treat people. They worry about what's going to happen. Are they going to be supported? What will be the outcome? The other part is the importance of training. And what is very important for each patient is the moment they come into a hospital, is there's a therapeutic treatment plan outlined that put the steps of what you want to do. If you're caring for somebody, you have alternative solutions. And if an event does occur, then it's having a method for debriefing, going through the problem, analysing it. And then finally what I come back to is the importance of measurement. If you don't measure what you're doing, you you can never know if you're being successful. And so it's one of the mantras that I commenced a service for the war veterans a number of years ago. And one of the steps that I put in place almost 16 years ago now is a database. And every person who's been through that service, everything about them is put into the database, and we can go and analyse the outcomes from that patient. And what we're starting to look at is, well, what are the predictors of response to treatment? How do you know that treatment will work for that person? And we're using some technology to analyse those processes. And we're using, and we've done the same thing in our own mental health service now, is one of the things I've put in place is the creation of a data warehouse. So we control every bit of data that goes in there. The state can have their own, but we've got more. And we're putting it together so that we can match what's going on with patients. We can actually, we now know which patients are going to be admitted, which streets people can be admitted to hospital from more frequently. So that allows us preemptively to reach out into the community to start to go, what do we do about those streets, those suburbs where there are problems. So that's what the data analysis is doing. But we're also, from a clinical area, is we're looking at what are the risks, which people do better with what treatment. And so it's having all that system available to us. So measurement is extremely important, but you have to keep your eye on the measurements very, very frequently. And you have to be able to understand what those measurements mean. So I'm going to finish there, because I thought today it provides opportunity for questions and maybe comments about your own experiences, because I see there are variations across the Czech Republic about seclusion and restraint. And certainly having been in England recently, where there were wards with no seclusion areas at all, and yet I've been to other hospitals where they have them. So I'd be interested in what your experiences are. I'm just going to put the earphones on.